the that's the origin of the name, but basically a zombie well is a well that's been plugged previously that's returned to life, if you will, and started flowing again. And we are seeing more and more of these happen, not just here in Texas, but all across the nation. California, most recently, Newport was in the news. But these are wells that had been previously plugged that have started flowing again. A lot of the time, it kind of based on several different factors. For us out here in West Texas, it's the over injection of produced water. In Texas alone, we're injecting, the new data that I have is 30 million barrels a day is being injected into the ground. So here in the Central Basin Platform, you've got wells that were more that were drilled in the 50s, plugged anywhere from the 60s to the 90s, and then we've added all this abnormal pressure, and it have either caused these plugs to fail or they weren't plugged properly in the first place. Hence, that's where the zombie well phenomenon starts. And I have to make a distinction between there's a lot of talk about orphan wells and zombie wells, and
Right.
two different classifications. Just for clarification, an orphan well is a well that has been abandoned, and there's no operator associated with that well. And here in Texas, they become a ward of the state.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Interesting. So, Les, first time I've met you before, and this is, but you wrote books about this topic. I guess I'm curious, how did you kind of come up with the name? I mean, were you watching a movie and you're like, oh, that's it, we're going to call it a zombie well, or is there more to this? Give us a little bit of your backstory and kind of what you've done in the past and written.
Well, I'm an engineer. I've worked in the oil field for 53 years and be 54 next year. But I grew up in the oil field. More especially, I grew up in a company town in the Texas Panhandle where wells were drilled just all over the place. One of those wells happened to be in the alley directly behind my house. It was probably 25 feet away from our house, and there was a perpetual patch of dead grass out in the middle of this alley, and we never knew what it was. Finally, my father told me that that was where an old well had been drilled, but it wasn't plugged properly, and natural gas was coming out of the well, and it was killing the grass. So, bright kid that I am, I dug it up. I thought I'd try to find the old well and see what was going on. Of course, I never found the well, but I had a pretty good hole in the ground, and my older brother came by and he said, well, I can smell the gas coming out of there. I wonder if it'll burn. Sure enough, he threw a match in it and it caught on fire. So we kind of started talking about that old zombie that was out in the alley. And in 21, I wrote a book on well integrity that dealt with workovers and reentries. And I used that term in the book, zombie well being an old dead well that had come back to life. And the name seemed to stick. So we've been using it now for the last 5 years or so with the notion that it's a pretty good descriptor of what happens to one of these wells. They're plugged, they seem to be completely dead, and then because of barrier deterioration, they began to leak. Now, Hawk mentioned, and he's absolutely right, that these wells are starting to leak at the surface, but the problem is they can also leak downhole between
Mm.
from one interval to another, and that is probably as serious a problem as we have with the surface leaks, and it's pretty widespread from what we've seen, and that's going to continue in time as these barrier systems that were originally installed continue to deteriorate.